Chapter 1. The Boy in the Hills. Long before he became a symbol of fear, power, and myth, Joaquín was just a boy. Born on April 4, 1957, in the rural town of La Tuna, he entered a world untouched by progress. His family lived in a small, crumbling house made of clay and tin, nestled on the slopes of the Sierra Madre Occidental. There were no paved roads, no schools within reach, and no easy way out. His father, Emilio, worked as a cattle rancher and local poppy grower, a quiet man who knew the land better than he knew affection. His mother, Maria Consuelo, was the anchor of the home, strong and devout. Joaquín was the third of 11 children, small in stature but quick to learn. He watched the way men spoke with pride when they whispered names like Felix Gallardo and Pedro Aviles. He noticed how the few trucks that passed through their town moved quietly at night, loaded with secrets, headed for cities beyond the mountains. The boy understood early that in these hills, silence was a language, and knowledge could be a weapon. His father wasn't a nurturing man. When harvests failed or tempers flared, the belt came down hard. Sometimes Joaquín would disappear for hours into the mountains, alone, building makeshift traps, gathering wild fruit, learning how to move through the thick brush without a sound. He felt freer in the wild than inside the clay walls of home. Nature, though rugged, was fairer than most men. He dropped out of school early, barely able to read, but numbers fascinated him. He learned to measure, to weigh, to divide, skills that would serve him long before he held power. By age 15, he was already working with his cousins, helping with small marijuana harvests. He would carry bales on his back for miles, winding through dry riverbeds and cactus fields, collecting pesos at the end of each journey. His hands hardened, his eyes sharpened. He wasn't like the other boys. He didn't drink, didn't waste his earnings. Instead, he saved, bought shoes when others went barefoot, paid his mother before buying for himself. His quiet nature made him nearly invisible, but the right people noticed. Among them was an older cousin, already connected to the networks forming beneath the surface of Mexico's criminal underworld. Joaquín's silence, his discipline, his endurance, they saw in him the makings of something more. And so the boy from the hills began walking paths he could not yet see the end of. In the land where shadows move slowly and the nights are deep, Joaquín Guzmán took his first steps toward a legacy written in both blood and wealth. Chapter 2. Whispers of the Trade. By the late 1970s, Joaquín was no longer just a mule for marijuana runs. Word had quietly traveled through Sinaloa's valleys and up through its pine-covered slopes that the young man from La Tuna was reliable, discreet, efficient, and above all, loyal. He didn't speak much, he didn't boast. In a world where words often killed faster than bullets, that made him valuable. The drug trade in Mexico was shifting. The routes once controlled by loosely connected smuggling families were beginning to consolidate. The Guadalajara cartel, led by Miguel Ángel Felix Gallardo, had begun weaving the smaller operations into a powerful tapestry, one that extended from the coca fields of Colombia to the streets of Los Angeles. Felix Gallardo was the maestro of that growing empire, and he needed men he could trust at the edges of his web. Joaquín was introduced to one of Gallardo's key lieutenants, Héctor El Güero Palma. Palma had an eye for ambition, and he saw in Joaquín something rare. Here was a young man who didn't crave attention, who never touched his own product, who delivered on time and with precision. So Palma brought him closer, gave him greater responsibilities, tested his resolve. Joaquín passed every test. At first, he supervised small airstrips tucked into the forests, ensuring that shipments from Colombia were received, weighed, and broken down properly. He paid the pilots, the loaders, the watchers. He knew every hand that touched the merchandise and exactly how much each should be paid. If a man stole or lied, Joaquín didn't shout. He simply removed the problem, quietly, permanently. His nickname, El Chapo, began to stick. It was short for El Chaparrito, or Shorty. Standing only 5'6", he was far from imposing, but the name, at first said with mockery, began to take on another tone, one of respect, even fear, because El Chapo was meticulous, and in the mountains of Sinaloa, where mistakes could get a man buried in a canyon, precision was a currency. By his mid-twenties, El Chapo had carved out his own corner within the trade. With Palmer's blessing, he started managing his own convoys, truckloads of marijuana and cocaine moving northward, bribing soldiers and federales along the way. He paid well. He was generous to the poor. In villages like his own, he'd leave envelopes of money at church steps, quiet gifts that earned loud loyalty. Still, the work was dangerous. The Colombian cartels, Medellin and Cali, were volatile partners. Palmer and Felix Gallardo played a dangerous game balancing their interests. As shipments increased, so did the risks. And when a shipment was seized or went missing, blame flowed downward like rain through the Sierra. El Chapo knew that loyalty in the trade was only as strong as the last load delivered. So he developed a philosophy: always keep moving, always stay useful, never become too visible, but never disappear completely. He learned the value of unpredictability and the power of silence. When others parted with mistresses and flashy cars, El Chapo stayed up counting pesos in the dim glow of a single light bulb, planning the next run, the next airstrip, the next escape route. He wasn't powerful yet, not like Felix Gallardo or the Colombians, but the foundations were forming. The hills that had raised him were whispering again, carrying his name a little farther each night. And for a boy who once wandered barefoot through the dry Sinaloan dust, that was the beginning of something monumental. In the shadows of larger men, El Chapo was learning how to build an empire, not through force alone, but through patience, precision, and the silence of the mountain wind. Chapter 3: Bloodlines and Borders. As the 1980s unfolded, the drug corridors grew wider, faster, and more violent. Colombia's Pablo Escobar was at his height, flooding the United States with rivers of cocaine. Mexico, once a pass-through point for marijuana and opium, had become a critical artery in the cocaine trade. Felix Gallardo's Guadalajara cartel was the bridge, and men like El Chapo were becoming its architects. El Chapo had moved up quickly. From airstrip coordinator to regional operator, he now oversaw major trafficking routes running through Sonora, Chihuahua, and Baja California. He studied maps the way soldiers study battlefields. He understood that success wasn't just about force, it was about geography. Mountain passes, desert trails, rural highways, all became part of his growing web. But power brought danger. In 1985, the balance began to tremble. Enrique Kiki Camarena, a US DEA agent stationed in Guadalajara, was kidnapped, tortured, and killed by the cartel. His murder shocked the United States and set off a diplomatic firestorm. The Reagan administration pressured Mexico to act. The Mexican government, long paid to look away, was now forced to respond. Felix Gallardo's empire wavered. Pressure from both Colombian partners and US agencies intensified. Arrests followed. Informants emerged. The once tightly knit cartel began to fracture under the weight of greed, fear, and external scrutiny. El Chapo watched all of it quietly. He knew the end was near for the centralized Guadalajara structure, and so, like a wolf sensing a coming winter, he prepared. He deepened his alliances with men he trusted: Hector Palmer, Ismael El Mayo Zambada, and the Beltran Leyva brothers. Together they began carving their own territories out of the collapsing Guadalajara empire. Joaquín returned more frequently to the Sierra Madre, using the rugged hills as ASA. Naxchuri. Up in the mountains, surrounded by loyal men and impossible terrain, he began laying the groundwork for what would become the Sinaloa cartel. It wasn't announced. There was no manifesto, no violent coup, just a quiet division of labor, roots, and responsibility. He opened new tunnels under the US-Mexico border. Unlike other traffickers who relied on bribed border agents or overloaded trucks, El Chapo used engineers. His tunnels were ventilated, lit, and equipped with rails, underground arteries of cocaine and methamphetamine snaking from Tijuana to California, from Nogales to Arizona. He also built communities. In the Sinaloan hills, he funded schools, clinics, churches. He gave jobs to the poor, medicine to the sick, and funerals to the families of fallen workers. Some saw him as a bandit. Others saw him as a saint. To many in the Sierra, the government was a shadow, but El Chapo was real. Still, the world outside the mountains remained volatile. Felix Gallardo was arrested in 1989. the era of the Guadalajara cartel officially ended. In its place rose newer, hungrier cartels, each more ruthless than the last. The Arellano Felix brothers took control of Tijuana. The Gulf cartel ruled the east, but it was the Sinaloa faction, led quietly by El Chapo and El Mayo, that moved with stealth and patience. The old ways, single bosses, centralized command, were vanishing. The future belonged to those who could adapt, split, disappear, and return stronger. El Chapo was no longer just a smuggler. He was becoming something else, something more elusive, more dangerous, more permanent. And though the border stood tall with its fences and agents and cameras, Joaquín knew it for what it was, a line drawn in dust, meant to be crossed. Chapter 4: A Kingdom of Dust. By the early 1990s, El Chapo's name had seeped into every corner of the drug corridors, stretching from South America to the American Southwest. Though he remained out of the public spotlight, law enforcement agencies on both sides of the border began connecting the invisible strings of his growing network. In the shadows of arrest warrants and shifting alliances, Joaquín Guzmán Loera was becoming a king without a crown, his power felt, but rarely seen. His organization was not run from boardrooms or polished compounds, but from ranches hidden deep in the Sierra Madre. Up in the hills of Sinaloa, messages were carried by radio, orders relayed through code. He had no phone, no emails, only trusted couriers. The law found it difficult to catch a ghost, especially one who paid so well to remain unseen. El Chapo believed in building an empire that bent but did not break. While other cartels used brute force and flashy violence to stake their claim, he preferred strategy. He offered peace to those who worked with him, and swift, silent punishment to those who didn't. He knew that blood only bought time, not respect. He expanded his network into Central America, forging deals with local gangs and militias, using them as couriers and enforcers. He opened new routes through Guatemala and Honduras, turning the jungle into a thoroughfare. At sea, his shipments moved hidden in fishing boats, quietly gliding north along the Pacific currents. His drugs traveled in frozen fish, in canned goods, in fabricated gas tanks and hollow tires. Where others saw obstacles, El Chapo saw opportunity. But the world was changing fast. Technology, once his ally, began turning against him. The U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration had upgraded its surveillance capabilities. Satellite tracking, wiretaps, and facial recognition began peeling away the layers of his network. And in Mexico, the government, under pressure from Washington, was forced to show action. Quiet deals became harder to maintain. Betrayals began to bubble beneath the surface. It was around this time that internal tension sparked with the Tijuana cartel, the Arellano Felix brothers. Once uneasy allies, the families were now rival empires. Each wanted control of the most lucrative plazas, the port cities, the crossings, the warehouses. Violence broke out in border towns. Assassins roamed the streets in stolen police cars, carrying machine guns and wearing flak vests. Civilians were caught in the crossfire. In 1993, that violence reached its peak. At the Guadalajara airport, a shootout erupted between El Chapo's men and those of the Arellano Felix cartel. In the chaos, a Roman Catholic cardinal, Juan Jesus Posadas Ocampo, was mistakenly gunned down. His death shocked the nation. Suddenly, El Chapo's name was no longer whispered in the valleys. It was shouted across television screens and printed on front pages. The government had no choice. Joaquín Guzmán Loera became Mexico's most wanted fugitive overnight. He fled back into the mountains, but the net had already begun to close. Days turned into weeks. The air grew tighter. Trails once safe were now watched. Even some of his allies began to distance themselves. And finally, in June of 1993, in the city of Tapachula, near the Guatemalan border, El Chapo was arrested. No shootout, no standoff, just a quiet capture in a hotel room. His first empire had fallen. The man who once controlled corridors of cocaine and cash was now locked behind the walls of Puente Grande, a maximum security prison. But not all prisons are equal, and not all kings give up their thrones so easily. Chapter 5. The Prison Within. Puente Grande Prison, rising like a fortress outside Guadalajara, was built to hold men who could not be trusted with freedom. Surrounded by high walls and steel gates, it was said to be escape-proof. Inside, concrete echoed with the shuffle of guards, the murmur of inmates, and the unspoken knowledge that even the walls had ears. When El Chapo entered in 1993, many believed it was the end of his story. They said no man could run a drug empire from behind bars. No man could reach his soldiers from within a cell. But El Chapo was not most men, and prison for him was not confinement. It was adaptation. Within months, he transformed the prison's inner workings. Guards were bribed, inmates were sorted, schedules were adjusted. El Chapo bought silence with pesos and loyalty with protection. He controlled who got food, who got medicine, who was moved, and who disappeared. His cell became a command post. Visitors arrived with coded messages. Lawyers carried instructions. Prison staff, once keepers, now served under his command. Outside the walls, the Sinaloa cartel didn't weaken. It grew. El Mayo Zambada stepped into a more visible role, guiding the cartel's movement, while El Chapo remained the phantom behind its operations. Together, they refined the business. More tunnels were built, more allies were bought, and the product, cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, continued to pour into the United States. The cartel's influence reached far. In places like Culiacan, locals whispered that El Chapo was safer behind bars than out in the open. His money flowed back into the countryside, into schools and roads and small farms. He funded baptisms, weddings, and community projects. And in return, people stayed quiet when strangers came asking questions. To them, El Chapo wasn't a criminal. He was a benefactor. Years passed. Presidents changed. Priorities shifted. But El Chapo waited. He paid. He planned. And in 2001, after nearly 8 years behind bars, the moment came. The official story was almost absurd. El Chapo escaped Puente Grande hidden in a laundry cart, rolled through a series of locked doors by bribed staff. He slipped out without a sound, disappearing into the early dawn. Some said he never left, that he had walked out in disguise. Others claimed helicopters were involved, but the truth didn't matter. What mattered was that he was gone. The escape was a humiliation for the Mexican government. The man they swore was contained had vanished, and with his freedom, El Chapo's legend only grew. No longer just a trafficker, he was now a folk hero, the invisible king, the mountain ghost, the man who could not be held. Back in the Sierra Madre, under the thick canopy of pine and cloud, El Chapo re-emerged, stronger, sharper, and more determined than ever. He had learned that empires don't fall when a man is captured. They fall when the mind behind them grows complacent. And El Chapo was not yet done building. Chapter 6. A Return to the Throne. The mountains of Sinaloa welcomed him back like an old friend. After 8 years in prison and an escape that defied logic, El Chapo returned to the wild terrain of his childhood, not as a fugitive but as a king in exile no longer. Hidden beneath the branches among men who would give their lives for him, he began to reassemble what prison could never dismantle, his power. His first moves were not loud. He didn't announce his return with violence. Instead, he called in old allies. Quiet meetings took place in hidden ranches under the veil of night. Messages were sent across the states, down into Central America, and north into the cities of the U.S. His network remained intact. His authority was unchallenged. Those who had waited in silence for his word now moved again. With El Mayo Zambada, his most trusted associate, El Chapo began modernizing the Sinaloa cartel. Where others used intimidation, they used innovation. Sophisticated tunnels beneath the border became longer and more complex. Their smuggling routes expanded across oceans. New markets opened in Europe and Asia. Methamphetamine labs multiplied in the hills. Technology played a role. His men used encrypted radios, burner phones, satellite uplinks. Every movement was calculated. Surveillance became second nature. Informants were monitored. Corrupt officials rotated before they could turn. The cartel operated like a corporation, with structure, incentives, and quiet punishment for disloyalty. El Chapo began to centralize again, but not in the old style of the Guadalajara days. His organization was fluid, cells operating semi-independently across territories. It allowed for quick movement, limited damage when arrests occurred, and made him harder to track. The US DEA and Mexican Marines ramped up their efforts, but El Chapo remained a shadow slipping through cracks in the system. His face appeared on most wanted lists. His name was mentioned in Senate hearings, news articles, and DEA briefings. But on the ground, in villages and towns of Sinaloa, he was still the man who paid for school books and medicine, the one who remembered the poor when the government didn't. His power came not just from fear, but from familiarity. Still, peace was temporary. The Mexican underworld was splintering, cartels multiplied, and with them, rivalries turned savage. The Zetas, once paramilitary enforcers for the Gulf Cartel, had broken off and grown more brutal. In Michoacán, the Knights Templar emerged, preaching religion and spilling blood. Chaos began to consume the regions where profit and power intersected. El Chapo responded carefully. He funded local self-defense groups in enemy territory. He used diplomacy as often as bullets, forging alliances with rival factions, then breaking them when needed. He controlled not just cocaine and meth, but the flow of information, knowing where and when to strike, and more importantly, when to disappear. He traveled by night in convoys through mountain passes. His homes were fortified but temporary, some carved into cliff sides, others hidden beneath farmland. He was rarely in one place for more than a day, yet his voice reached everywhere. By the mid-2000s, he wasn't just the most powerful trafficker in Mexico, he was the most wanted drug lord in the world. But with power comes exposure, and El Chapo, for all his planning, knew that eyes were always watching. Satellites, drones, informants. The US was no longer merely observing, they were hunting. And though the mountains had always protected him, even shadows eventually fade beneath too much light. Chapter 7. The Eyes in the Sky. By 2009, Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán was more than a name. He was a symbol. A face etched on government posters and whispered in border towns. The US offered a $5 million reward. Mexico matched it. But even with satellite tracking, surveillance drones, and wiretaps woven through the cartel's communication channels, he remained untraceable. For every step forward authorities made, El Chapo slipped 2 steps deeper into the hills. He knew how they hunted. He studied their rhythms, their tactics, their limitations. His team rotated vehicles, replaced radios every few days, and left decoys moving along familiar routes. Soldiers would raid a ranch only to find it empty, still warm with the breath of recent life. His escape routes were dug into the very earth, tunnels that vanished into caves, riverbeds, or the basements of ordinary homes. From his remote hideouts, he observed the game shift. The war on drugs declared by Mexico's president had intensified. Soldiers flooded cartel territory, cities turned to battlegrounds, helicopters circled towns like vultures, while convoys of masked Marines rolled through narrow streets. But the violence was not one-sided. Cartels answered with ambushes, roadside bombs, and executions meant to send messages. Amidst the chaos, El Chapo held his ground, not by brute force, but through quiet strategy. He paid off the right officials. He offered peace to smaller factions if they pledged loyalty. When war couldn't be avoided, he fought swiftly and without warning. His reach extended beyond drugs. He invested in construction companies, agriculture, mining. His money moved through shell businesses and offshore accounts, each layer concealing the one beneath it. His personal life remained a mystery. Rumors swirled that he had taken a young bride, that he had fathered more children, that he'd built entire neighbors. Roods for his family, guarded by loyalists. But none of it was confirmed. He appeared in no photos, gave no interviews. Only stories drifted down from the mountains, of a man both ruthless and generous, feared and admired. The DEA intensified its focus. US agencies coordinated with Mexican Marines, bypassing corrupt local forces. Intelligence was collected piece by piece, voice recordings, intercepted messages, sightings. A network of informants began to bloom. Former allies turned for money or protection, and yet El Chapo remained a ghost. Each near capture seemed almost orchestrated, as if he could sense the movement of the hunt. In one village, soldiers stormed a safe house seconds after he slipped through a tunnel beneath the floorboards. In another, they surrounded a cabin only to find it rigged with distractions, clothes, food, signs of life, but not the man himself. The Sinaloa cartel flourished under his command. While rival groups collapsed into bloody infighting, El Chapo offered structure. He absorbed what others left behind: roots, men, influence. Cities like Juarez, once controlled by hostile factions, became battlegrounds he slowly dominated. But with each success came greater attention, greater pressure. The eyes in the sky grew sharper, the margin for error thinner. And deep within him, El Chapo knew the truth that haunted every king who ruled from the shadows. Power was not a possession, it was a pursuit, and sooner or later, the hunt always caught up, even in the mountains, even in silence. Chapter 8. The fall begins quietly. It didn't begin with a betrayal or a gunfight. It started with a phone call, a quiet click traced across borders by men wearing headsets in darkened rooms. Analysts at the DEA, working with Mexico's Marines and intelligence agents, had pieced together the thinnest of threads: whispers of movement near Culiacan, odd behavior in a small coastal town, intercepted messages between lieutenants that didn't quite hide what they thought they did. The net wasn't cast yet, but it was tightening. El Chapo had grown used to control. He built his empire on consistency, loyalty, and the assumption that silence brought safety, and for years it had. But now, the very tools he had once used to elude capture, encrypted radios, burner phones, coded messages, were turning against him. Technology had evolved, so had the hunt. His cartel remained powerful, shipments moved with precision, his people stayed paid, his name still inspired fear, but the walls were beginning to whisper. His closest circle, once sealed tight, began to leak. Not loud, not obvious, but just enough to shift the wind. In early 2014, intelligence units intercepted a message suggesting that El Chapo was no longer moving constantly through the mountains, but had taken residence in the coastal city of Mazatlan. Some believed he had grown too confident, others thought he simply needed rest. He was nearly 60 now, and though the legend stayed young, the man did not. His home in Mazatlan was modest from the outside, a plain high-rise apartment near the beach. But beneath the tiles and behind the closets, tunnels ran into the sewer system. Escape routes had been carved beneath bathtubs, wardrobes, and kitchen floors. Armed guards patrolled nearby homes disguised as civilians. The structure was fortified not with concrete, but with time. Yet the pressure was constant. The Marines moved. In silence, aided by American intelligence, they raided properties around Culiacan first, arresting key associates. One by one, the circle tightened. The goal was not to catch him by surprise, but to push him toward a predictable exit. And then, one dawn in February 2014, they came for him. The operation was swift. No warning, no sirens. Mexican Marines in full gear flooded the building. They expected resistance. But El Chapo, asleep beside his wife, was caught off guard. He reached for an escape hatch, but found it blocked. His guards had been neutralized, his weapons untouched. He was arrested without a shot fired. The news spread like wildfire. The man who had slipped through tunnels, outrun helicopters, and mocked governments was finally in custody. Photographs showed him bearded, calm, wearing a rumpled shirt. No theatrics, no fury, just a quiet end to a long chase. But for those who knew him, it didn't feel like the final chapter. The mountains had taught El Chapo many things. Chief among them, sometimes the best escape begins with surrender. And far from the headlines in the quiet corners of Sinaloa, the people didn't speak of defeat. They waited. Because legends, they knew, rarely end when the world says they should. Chapter 9. The Prisoner's Smile. When Joaquín Guzmán was flown to Altiplano, Mexico's most secure prison, reporters gathered along fences and tarmacs to catch a glimpse of him. The cameras flashed, and for a moment the world saw something unexpected, not anger or fear, but a faint smile on his face. It was not defiance, it was something quieter, something colder, a smile not for them, but for himself. Altiplano was a fortress of concrete and steel, high walls rimmed with surveillance, motion detectors beneath floors, guards vetted with scrutiny, prisoners isolated in soundproof cells, movement timed to prevent even the possibility of planning, no sunlight, no conversation, no freedom. But El Chapo had already done time in a place just like this. and he had left it behind once before. Inside, he kept his routines. He did not speak unnecessarily. He ate sparingly. He studied the guards, the architecture, the rhythms of the building. His eyes noted what his words did not: who opened what door, what time the lights changed, when the guards switched shifts. He filed it all away. On the surface, he seemed calm, beaten, perhaps, done. But beneath the silence, the wheels were already turning. Outside the walls, the Sinaloa cartel remained intact. El Mayo Zambada, still at large, continued to oversee day-to-day operations. Profits remained steady, roots held, and most importantly, loyalty endured. For the men of Sinaloa, El Chapo's arrest was not the end of an era. It was an interruption, temporary, like a storm that passes and leaves the fields greener. Construction began beneath the prison months after his arrest, not officially, not publicly, but carefully, quietly. A tunnel, 2 kilometers long, was dug beneath his cell, equipped with ventilation, reinforced walls, and a motorcycle mounted on rails to move quickly through the darkness. It emerged in a modest construct site beyond the prison walls, disguised as just another half-built home. The tunnel was an engineering feat, but more than that, it was a message that even in chains, El Chapo's reach extended beyond walls and beyond fear. On July 11, 2015, just before lights out, El Chapo vanished from his cell. One moment he was there, the next, a hole gaped beneath his shower. By the time guards noticed, he was gone. 2 kilometers away, he climbed out of the tunnel, mounted a waiting motorcycle, and disappeared into the Mexican night. The escape stunned the world. Again, officials scrambled. Helicopters flew, roadblocks were erected, but it was too late. He had slipped into the mountains once more, into the forests of Sinaloa, where the trees bowed for him and the roads bent in his favor. It was the most audacious prison break in modern history, a silent escape from one of the most fortified prisons in Latin America. But to those who knew him, to those who understood the code of the mountains, it wasn't audacity, it was inevitability. And in the hills, where the stories were told in whispers, the people smiled too, because El Chapo was free again. Chapter 10. A Kingdom Reborn. The mountains welcomed him like a son returning from war. Wind rustled through pine branches as if to whisper his name once more. El Chapo was home. The dirt paths that wound through the Sierra Madre had seen him as a boy, as a king, and now as a ghost risen again. In villages hidden by brush and cliff, candles were lit quietly, not in celebration, but in acknowledgement. He was back. From deep within Sinaloa, El Chapo reasserted his grip. There were no grand announcements, no public executions, no parades of power, just movement, orders given, positions shuffled, couriers dispatched. His lieutenants resumed their ranks, his rivals kept their distance. He was not the same man who had ruled in the 90s. Age had slowed his stride but sharpened his eyes. He knew that his time above the surface was limited. The walls were closing faster now. Technology was unforgiving. And yet, in the brief window between his escape and the inevitable next hunt, he rebuilt, quietly, carefully. He moved between safe houses like mist, never in one place more than a night, always underground, behind layers of armed men and blind alleys. In every village he passed through, families remained quiet. No one betrayed him, not out of fear, but out of familiarity. In those hills, El Chapo had built more than tunnels. He had built memory. The Sinaloa cartel, thought by many to be destabilized by his imprisonment, now flexed once more. New shipments flowed through maritime routes. Airstrips buzzed with activity under cover of night. The cartel moved drugs, money, weapons, and people with renewed precision. Border tunnels, stretching beneath Arizona and California, reopened. Businesses tied to the cartel resumed operations like machines returning to motion after a pause. But freedom came with a cost. The international pressure mounted swiftly. The United States, embarrassed, harassed by the second escape, redoubled efforts. Mexican authorities, humiliated on the global stage, could no longer hide behind bureaucracy. A task force was assembled, backed by advanced surveillance, drones, undercover agents, and phone tracking technologies that had evolved far beyond what El Chapo had seen during his previous years underground. Every call, every courier, every vehicle now left a trace. He knew this, and yet he could not stop completely. An empire cannot sleep. Even shadows cast long footprints when the sun moves just right, and in his own ranks, ambitions stirred. Some whispered that El Chapo's time had passed, that the future of Sinaloa belonged to the new generation, sons of traffickers, nephews of bosses, young men with American sneakers and blood on their hands. And still Joaquín remained. For every whisper of doubt, he answered with order. For every attempted challenge, a subtle reminder, his name still held weight. But the pressure was no longer just external. Inside he could feel it, the turning tide, the possibility that the next safe house might be the last, the next knock at the door might not come from loyal hands. And somewhere in the quiet of a mountain dawn, as clouds clung low to the valley and the pine needles glistened with dew, El Chapo looked out from the window of a temporary home, no longer blind to what was coming. The mountains had given him everything, but they could not protect him forever. By early 2016, the noose around El Chapo's empire was tightening with clinical precision. The freedom he had briefly tasted after his escape was eroding with each passing week. The Marines, now guided by real-time intelligence and aerial surveillance, were closing in, and for the first time in decades, it was no longer just about disrupting the cartel. It was about capturing him, alive. The manhunt was quiet but relentless. Every contact he made, every transaction, every movement was now traced. His circle, though loyal, was not immune to fear. Some whispered too much, others were tracked without realizing it. Technology had evolved into something ruthless. A misstep no longer took months to discover. It could be known within hours. Still, El Chapo moved, from ranch to ranch, from the edge of Durango to the quiet slopes of Nayarit. Each hideout was temporary, fortified only with trust and time. He slept in underground chambers, surrounded by guards with encrypted radios and loyalty thicker than blood. He ate simply, spoke little, listened constantly. But outside, the world was changing faster than ever. The cartel continued its business, meth, fentanyl, cocaine, but now under heavier pressure. Interdictions at ports had increased. Cartel accountants were being arrested in Guatemala, in Honduras, in Chicago. His sons, Los Chapitos, were growing into leadership roles, and though capable, they lacked the quiet patience their father had cultivated over years. Their methods were louder, their enemies younger. The streets were different now. One night, while hiding in a house on the edge of Los Mochis, El Chapo made a mistake. Perhaps it was comfort, perhaps overconfidence. He placed a call, not through his usual encrypted channels, but a more vulnerable connection. A traceable signal, small and quick, but enough. The call was intercepted. Analysts in Mexico City and Langlois flagged it within minutes. A location was identified, a decision was made, and before dawn, an elite Marine unit was mobilized. On January 8, 2016, in the quiet hours of morning, the Mexican Navy descended on the Los Mochis safe house. The firefight that followed was brief but fierce. El Chapo's gunmen opened fire as the Marines stormed the house. Grenades echoed, walls splintered, the hallway rang with automatic gunfire. Several men died, others fled. And El Chapo, he ran. Through a hidden tunnel behind a mirror, he vanished into the city's sewer system, accompanied by one bodyguard. The underground maze twisted through darkness and decay, but even in that place he knew the turns. He emerged blocks away, hijacked a vehicle, and tried to vanish again. But this time, the escape failed. Not long after, he was spotted by a patrol and taken into custody on the side of a highway. There were no final words, no resistance, just a quiet acceptance. He had run, he had fought, he had returned, and this time there would be no tunnel beneath the floor. His arrest was confirmed within hours. Photos showed him, bearded, tired, but intact. The world watched again, but this time the reaction was different. Not surprise, not celebration, just inevitability. El Chapo was no longer the ghost, he was the prisoner. Again. El Chapo's return to the world of prisons was not the quiet, unnoticed entry it once had been. This time, he was no longer a fugitive, slipping through cracks and shadows. He was a symbol, one the world had waited years to see captured, but now that he was in custody, the weight of that capture hung heavier than any of the headlines had ever suggested. His first stop was the maximum security Altiplano prison, the same facility from which he had escaped so audaciously just a year before. The government moved him there, hoping to avoid any repeat of his remarkable escape. They placed him in solitary confinement, but as they had learned before, a cell was never enough to contain a man like El Chapo. The Sinaloa cartel, despite the arrest of their leader, did not falter in the immediate aftermath. Business continued. Methamphetamine shipments flowed into the United States, but El Chapo's empire was showing the cracks of its age. While the older generation held power, younger men, sons, cousins, loyalists, were stepping forward with different ideas, different strategies. The cartel was fragmenting into competing factions, and rivalries were beginning to fester like wounds in the dark. From behind prison walls, El Chapo could no longer control his world with the same precision. His ability to communicate, though extensive, was hindered by the tighter security measures in place around him. He relied on intermediaries to pass on messages, men and women still loyal to him outside the prison's walls, but the silence between his instructions and their execution felt longer, more distant. The very structure he had built to ensure his dominance was beginning to show signs of strain. Meanwhile, his trial loomed, a series of hearings set to answer the questions the world had been asking for years. On January 19, 2017, El Chapo was flown to the United States to face a litany of charges related to drug trafficking, murder, and money laundering. He would stand before a U.S. court charged with orchestrating one of the largest drug operations in modern history. The world's attention was unrelenting. His trial became a spectacle in and of itself. There, in a courtroom in Brooklyn, New York, El Chapo's fate was decided not just by the law, but by the weight of the myth surrounding him. Lawyers, prosecutors, and witnesses took the stand, one after another, detailing the scope of his empire. But in the room, under the fluorescent lights, El Chapo remained an enigma. His eyes, calm and focused, rarely showed emotion. The case was overwhelming. Evidence was compiled, testimony stacked high. Intercepted messages, wiretaps, photographs, all painted a picture of a man who had built his empire not on the brute force of violence, but on meticulous planning, loyalty, and cold, calculated control. But even as the court presented its evidence, one question lingered over everything. How did a man who had once commanded such power, who had escaped from the very walls built to hold him, come to face the inevitable? The trial lasted for months, and despite his defense team's best efforts, it became clear that the conviction was all but certain. The mountain was crumbling beneath him, and El Chapo could do nothing to stop it. His influence waned even as his image remained larger than life. The era of Joaquín Guzmán, once untouchable, had come to an undeniable end. In the final months of his trial, El Chapo was sentenced to life in prison, plus 30 years. His hopes of ever returning to the mountains or the streets of Sinaloa were extinguished. The quiet, determined man who had once slipped through the cracks was now locked away in a solitary existence far from the world he had shaped. And so, after all the years, all the betrayals, all the blood spilled in the ends, aim of power, El Chapo was not just the prisoner of the U.S. government. He had become a prisoner of his own story, a tale that would continue to echo in the streets, the mountains, and the darkened. They flew him under heavy guard, escorted by U.S. Marshals, sealed within the steel belly of a jet whose destination was never broadcast. There were no reporters at the gates, no crowds along fences, just silence. He had left behind the noise of courtrooms and the shuffle of lawyers. Now, he was headed somewhere different, final, hidden. The plane touched down in Colorado, a barren, high-altitude stretch of land surrounded by miles of fencing and isolation. The prison was the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility, Florence ADX, known simply as the Alcatraz of the Rockies. It was here El Chapo would serve out his sentence, life without parole, ADX. Florence was unlike any other prison in the world. Designed for the most dangerous, the most high-profile, it was built not only to confine, but to erase. A fortress of silence, thick concrete walls, motion detectors, steel gates operated by remote. It held terrorists, cartel leaders, domestic extremists, men whose names echoed in international headlines, but who now existed behind soundproof walls, cut off from the world. El Chapo's cell was small, 7 feet by 12, a concrete bed, a steel sink, a toilet bolted to the wall. A narrow window, barely 4 inches wide, allowed a sliver of sky. Through it he could see nothing, not the horizon, not a tree, not the mountains he once ruled, just a rectangle of pale blue, indifferent and infinite. He was allowed 1 hour outside per day, alone, in a concrete yard known as the box, no grass, no open air, just another space surrounded by concrete and silence, and yet, even there, his name lived. Inside Florence, guards never spoke his name casually. Inmates speculated about him but rarely saw him. His movements were isolated, his meals delivered through slots. He did not mix with others, not because of fear, but because isolation was the design. To break man, to make them forget the sound of their own voice. He kept his thoughts close. He still remembered the valleys, the smell of dust and pine. He remembered the weight of gold watches, the sound of radios crackling in the hills, the way the air shifted before a betrayal. But now, the past lived only in memory. Letters were monitored, visits restricted, no calls, no tunnels, just time, steady and without end. Outside, his cartel adapted. His sons, the Chapitos, stepped forward, each with their own interpretation of the empire. El Mayo Zambada, still free, continued to guide from the shadows. The Sinaloa cartel remained powerful, profitable, ruthless. But the core had shifted. The old codes were fading. Violence, once strategic, became reactive. Alliances shifted with the wind. New enemies emerged from within and without. And though El Chapo's name still demanded respect, it was no longer the command of a present king, but the reverence given to a fallen statue. In Florence, he read when allowed, wrote carefully, stared through that narrow window where the seasons changed but the sky remained the same. He did not complain, did not resist. His silence was not surrender, it was memory. The man who had climbed from the dirt of Badiraguato to the throne of a Narco empire now stood at the edge of history, neither mourned nor forgotten, just still. The world moved on. But within those concrete walls, Joaquín Guzmán Loera, El Chapo, sat unmoved. The empire had fallen. The silence was final. Far from the cold confines of Florence, the wind still moved through the Sierra Madre like a whisper too old to name. The villagers in Badiraguato, aging and unhurried, still spoke of El Chapo with a softness that made it seem he had never left. In those hills, time was slower, memory longer, and silence deeper. They remembered him not as the prisoner in a U.S. cell, but as the boy who carried buckets of water barefoot down stone paths, who once asked for work at local ranches, and who later returned with wealth that rained down like gold dust on the villages that had raised him. Roads had been paved where none had existed, schools built, clinics funded. For many, those gestures meant more than the chaos that followed. Children still played near homes where soldiers once stood guard. Old men still leaned on porches that had once been watched through binoculars by DEA operatives hidden in the brush. And though the world saw a kingpin, to some, he remained a son of the mountains, a man of the land. But even in those quiet valleys, change was coming. The cartel had not disappeared, it had evolved. New factions now controlled key passages once overseen by El Chapo's lieutenants. Some remained loyal to the memory of his reign. Others, hungry for power, forged their own paths. His sons, Ovidio, Ivan Archivaldo, Jesus Alfredo, each carved out territory, wearing their father's legacy like armor and burden. They were known as Los Chapitos, the Little Chapos, but their approach was often more reckless, less measured. Their fights were louder, their alliances more fragile. Though they inherited his name, they had not lived his patience, and the world they navigated was less forgiving than the one their father ruled. Still, the cartel remained formidable. Despite arrests, seizures, and betrayals, it endured. Not through central leadership, but through networks, scattered, hidden, yet efficient. Sinaloa was no longer just a name, it was a brand, a myth, a signal that power, even fractured, could still move in silence. Meanwhile, in the US, El Chapo's story became part of a broader narrative, told in books, in documentaries, in courtroom transcripts that read like novels. But the man behind the legend remained unseen, locked behind layers of concrete and time. His cell in Florence remained unchanged. The light never brightened, the air never shifted. He aged slowly, almost imperceptibly, his world shrinking until it was no larger than the concrete around him. He spoke rarely, listened often, dreamed perhaps of younger days, of fields of green before they were carved into routes of escape. Outside, the world debated him. Some called him a monster, others a genius. Some blamed him for the drug war's endless toll. Others blamed the systems that made men like him inevitable. But within the mountains, where the air is thin and the trees have long memories, the questions mattered less. There, the story was simpler. He came from here. He rose, he fell, and somewhere in that fall the mountains remained. Even as El Chapo faded into obscurity behind the concrete hush of Florence, the remnants of his empire moved like quiet threads through the corridors of global trafficking. His name, though locked away, still held weight among men who operated in whispers across oceans and borders, where the lines of legality blurred into a haze of shadows. Sinaloa, no longer governed by a single voice, functioned as a federation of sorts. Territories were divided, routes maintained, and new players emerged, not just in the hills of Culiacan or the alleys of Tijuana, but in ports along Ecuador, in forests of Michoacán, in distant cities where chemicals became currency. The cartel had learned to adapt, its strength no longer reliant on charisma or central command, but on systems, quiet, precise, effective. The Chapitos, while inheritors of a violent legacy, were not the only ones competing for influence. El Mayo Zambada, elusive and untouched by law, remained the phantom strategist behind many of Sinaloa's enduring maneuvers. Though older now, his survival was no accident. He had mastered invisibility, preferring manipulation to spectacle. Unlike El Chapo, who at times embraced the myth of his persona, El Mayo rejected the spotlight with quiet discipline. Yet, even with El Chapo's physical absence, law enforcement agencies around the world remained focused on his network. Investigations deepened, associates were flipped, trafficking routes were monitored, cryptic messages intercepted. But the web, designed long ago, had been woven with care. Its resilience lay in redundancy. If one branch was cut, another adapted. Meanwhile, in Florence, El Chapo's routine remained unchanged. He rose at dawn, ate his meals in silence, exercised alone. His cell was inspected multiple times daily, every movement documented, every communication vetted. There were no interviews, no new statements, only the echo of footsteps in the hallway and the soft hum of fluorescent lights overhead. He had become a relic of his own era, a man whose story was taught in classrooms on criminal justice, whose methods were dissected in intelligence briefings, whose life had become both warning and legend. Yet within him, there was still a spark of presence. He was not broken, not repentant, simply still. Occasionally a letter would reach him, carefully screened, redacted, but intact, sometimes from family, sometimes from admirers, sometimes from strangers who knew only the story. He read them all, never replied, but they reminded him that the world still remembered, even if only through the myths. Outside, in the highest circles of finance and politics, traces of his operations lingered. Offshore accounts, shell companies, real estate purchased with silent dollars. The legacy of his reach extended far beyond what headlines ever grasped. His story, in truth, had always been more than violence and tunnels. It was about power, about filling a void where institutions had failed, and about the cost of becoming too large to ignore. But now, the man who once controlled oceans of narcotics, who ordered movements with a whisper, now lived in a space smaller than any of his former offices. No lieutenants, no gold-plated pistols, no escape hatches, just memory and time. El Chapo had not vanished. He had simply moved to the far edge of consequence, and from there the world went on. In the silence of Florence, where the wind never touched the walls and the sun could only be glimpsed through slivers of glass, memory became the final currency. For Joaquín Guzmán, it wasn't the gold nor the power that returned to him in the quiet hours. It was the faces, the voices, the pieces of his past that now drifted in and out of the shadows like old ghosts. He would close his eyes and see Doña Consuelo's face, his mother, the matriarch of the Guzmán family, weathered by years of hardship, yet strong. Her hands had once pulled water from dry wells, had raised children on the unforgiving edge of the Sierra Madre. He could still feel the weight of her eyes when she looked at him, not with fear or pride, but with a quiet knowing. She had watched him go from selling oranges on the roadside to becoming the most wanted man in the Western Hemisphere, and yet she had always seen only her son. Sometimes his thoughts drifted to the hills of La Tuna, where the dirt was soft and the nights came alive with the rustle of trees. The scent of pine and dust lingered in his mind, mixed with the sound of boots on dry ground. In those early years, the ambition that stirred inside him wasn't born from greed, it was born from hunger. Hunger for more than what his small world could offer, hunger to matter, hunger to climb. He remembered Nacho Coronel, Arturo Beltran Leyva, Amado Carrillo, men who had once shared seats at the same table, who had risen together like a tide. Some were brothers, others became enemies, but in those early days they were visionaries of a brutal world, each building their own fiefdoms, each negotiating with life and death in the same breath. He thought often of his children, of the sons who now stood in the corridors of the empire he had once commanded. Ovidio, the quiet one, drawn to calculation. Ivan Archivaldo, more volatile, more like him in his youth. Sus Alfredo, introspective, measured. He wondered what parts of him they carried and what they had had to become in a world far less forgiving than the one he had built. Their names now filled the headlines he no longer saw. He could only imagine the burden they carried, the weight of the name, the curse of inheritance. Would they remember him as a father, or just as a myth? There was no one to ask, no one to answer, only the hours passing slowly, only the silence, thicker than any cell wall. He sometimes recalled the tunnels, the smell of the earth, the sound of digging through the night. Those dark corridors had once been symbols of his ingenuity, his defiance. They had carried him to freedom, to power, to escape. Now they existed only in memory, carved not beneath the border, but beneath his ribs, like secret scars. Outside, the world changed. Alliances shifted. Other cartels grew bold. Jalisco New Generation with their ruthless efficiency, the remnants of the Zetas, splinter groups with no loyalty and less patience. It was no longer his world. The rules had changed. The codes had vanished. He did not rage, did not fight. There was no point. He knew what few ever accepted, that even kings fall, that even empires turn to dust, and that, in the end, all that remains are the memories we carry in silence, and the ones the world refuses to forget. Far from the concrete silence of Florence, the city of Culiacán still pulsed beneath the weight of a legacy that refused to die. Streets once patrolled by El Chapo's men now belonged to his sons and their rivals, a city shaped not by laws but by whispers. Every alley held a memory, every checkpoint a reminder of who had ruled and who still watched from the shadows. Culiacán had changed, the skyline grew. New construction stretched along the edges of town, but the old rhythms remained. Narco corridors still echoed from car stereos late into the night. Young men leaned against motorcycles, wearing gold chains heavy with borrowed meaning. In the neighborhoods that El Chapo had once protected, people still spoke of him like a saint, half man, half myth. They remembered the trucks of food he sent during floods. The envelopes passed quietly to widows and workers, the way his presence, though often unseen, had kept certain violence at bay. Back then, there had been rules, boundaries. Now, the new generation ran hot. Their violence spilled into the streets with little warning. Gunfire came in broad daylight. Lines were crossed, civilians caught in crossfire, children kept home from school. In the homes of the Chapitos, security was absolute. Surveillance equipment, private guards, convoys of armored vehicles, but there was no peace, only preparation. The DEA watched from afar. Mexican Marines planned, waited, struck. Raids came in the middle of the night, doors broken, family members arrested, a constant cycle of control and collapse. And yet, the cartel adapted. Synthetic drugs replaced the old shipments. Fentanyl, cheap and potent, flowed northward in silent quantities that dwarfed cocaine. Labs in Sinaloa's backcountry mixed powders with precision, hidden beneath tarps and guarded by men with rifles and radios. The profits were immense, the risk greater than ever. But power had fragmented. El Chapo had ruled through loyalty and discipline. The Chapitos ruled by lineage, but their unity was thin. Rumors swirled, tensions among the brothers, betrayals among allies. El Mayo, still in the background, observed but interfered rarely. His silence was a message, his absence a shield. Meanwhile, rivals pressed in. The Jalisco New Generation cartel, known for their brutality, pushed into traditional Sinaloan territory. Cities like Tepic, Mazatlan, and Guadalajara became battlegrounds, not just for drugs, but for the future of the trade. Everyone wanted the roots. Everyone wanted the myth. Back in Florence, El Chapo felt none of it, but he sensed it. Not through reports or visitors, those no longer came. He sensed it in the change of the air, in the way time thickened. He knew what ambition did to bloodlines. He had seen too many empires rot from within. Sometimes, during the long nights, he would think of the city, of the heat rising from its streets, of the people watching from balconies as convoys rolled past, of the way his name still moved through Culiacan, like a ghost with no place to rest. He wondered if it still meant something, or if it had become a tool for others, a mask, a warning. The king was gone, but the kingdom? It remembered, and it waited. In the years that followed El Chapo's final extradition, loyalty became both a relic and a weapon for those who had once walked beside him, his lieutenants, his couriers, his enforcers. The cost of silence had grown steeper with time. Some still held to the old codes. Others, weakened by prison walls or shifting alliances, began to speak. The US government built case after case on the back of such voices. Witnesses once considered untouchable emerged in courtrooms, men like Damaso Lopez Núñez, known as El Licenciado, who had once been a trusted confidant, almost family. When he turned state's witness, the betrayal was seismic. He spoke not only of logistics and smuggling routes, but of meetings in safe houses, bodies buried in desert, sums counted in cash so thick it could buy silence for years. His testimony cut deeper than any bullet ever could. Other former associates followed. Some testified out of fear, others in pursuit of reduced sentences. Each added a piece to the puzzle: locations, names, dates, layered stories confirming what law enforcement had long suspected but could never prove. The prosecution of El Chapo became less about capturing a man and more about unraveling a world. Still, some refused to speak, out of fear, out of code, or simply because silence was the last dignity they could afford. For those, loyalty wasn't just a value, it was survival. Back in Mexico, the concept of loyalty evolved. Among the younger factions, it was no longer about personal bonds or shared beginnings. It became transactional, fluid, a matter of convenience. Alliances formed and collapsed in weeks. Betrayals arrived with a handshake. Informants fed both sides, playing a dangerous game that rarely ended well. Even within the Guzmán family, questions swirled. Were all the sons aligned? Had deals been made behind closed doors? The Chapitos denied every accusation, but the streets had their own way of whispering. In Florence, El Chapo was aware of the shifting winds. He received no news, no updates. But he had lived long enough to know that in the world he had built, the future was always uncertain, and loyalty was the first to crack when power began to shift. He thought often of those he had trusted. Some were dead, taken by rivals, by soldiers, by their own ambition. Others were still out there, living quieter lives, protected by anonymity or wealth. He didn't resent the ones who had disappeared into comfort. He understood. Everyone in the end made their choice. He had made his. He had chosen the tunnels over treaties, the risk over the retreat, and it had led him here, to a place beyond betrayal, beyond revenge. In Florence there were no loyalties, no alliances, only the slow rhythm of days blending into one another, and the knowledge that, at one time, men would have died for his word. Now they barely spoke his name. Outside, the world moved on. New leaders, new wars, but the old story still lingered beneath it all. A story of loyalty, of what it gives, and what it takes. There are places where a man's voice never fades, where even long after the man is gone, his words remain tucked inside the walls, beneath the soil, behind the silence of guarded stairs. For Joaquín Guzmán, those echoes still lived, not just in Culiacán or the jungles of Sinaloa, but in the minds of those who had once followed him with unwavering obedience. He had not spoken publicly in years, no interviews, no press. And yet his silence held more weight than 100 speeches. His power was no longer in action, but in memory, in legend, in the whispered invocations from young soldiers hoping to mirror his rise, in the old friends who still raised a glass to his name in backroom cantinas, even as the world changed around them. In the courts of Washington, prosecutors called him a symbol of terror, a dealer of destruction, a master of escape and manipulation. But in the countryside of Mexico, some still called him a protector, a man who had built hospitals, paid for weddings, given work when no one else would. Both were true, neither complete. The real story lived in the middle, in the grey spaces where morality bent under the weight of desperation. Those who had served him did not forget. They remembered his methods, the discipline he demanded, the clarity with which he ruled. His messages had been brief, direct, always coded, yet unmistakable. He had ruled not just through fear, but through control, of information, of movement, of mood. Now those echoes took on different forms. A phrase passed from one trafficker to another, a name written on a wall, a cautious glance when a convoy rolled through town. These were the subtle traces of power, the kind that outlasts a man's physical presence. His family carried part of it, willingly or not. His sons wore it in their posture, in the way they were spoken to, in the quiet respect still given by older lieutenants who remembered who their father was. Yet power had changed. Where El Chapo once centralized control, the new structure was looser, more volatile. There was no longer a single voice at the top, just layers, silos, shared command with fragile threads. In prison, El Chapo often sat in long stillness, his eyes fixed on nothing, but his mind moved backwards, tracing the evolution of power as he had known it, from hand-carried messages between ranches to encrypted systems, from face-to-face loyalty to factions stitched together by necessity. He knew the drug trade would not end with him. He had never believed it would. The machinery was too large now, too interwoven with the world's demands. He had simply mastered it for a time, navigated it, commanded it. Then, like all who reach too high, he had been pulled down, not by fate, but by the inevitable consequences of his scale. But still, his name lingered. On the lips of journalists, etched into DEA briefings, memorialized in songs, romanticized in the minds of those who misunderstood what it truly meant to lead a cartel. It wasn't glamour, it wasn't freedom, it was risk, exhaustion, a life without peace. Now, in the quiet of his cell, he finally had peace. But peace, he understood, was different from freedom. And even in stillness, the echoes of power continued to ripple, soft and constant, like the sound of water beneath concrete. Inside the concrete walls of USP Florence ADX, days blurred into each other, forming a pattern so monotonous it became invisible. Joaquín Guzmán no longer measured time in hours or meals. He measured it in thoughts, in the small flickers of memory that rose uninvited, in the brief, hollow dreams that came just before sleep, and the empty awakenings that followed. He had once mastered the physical world, mountains, jungles, borders, plains, tunnels. But now the only terrain left to explore was the one within, a vast mental labyrinth, carved from years of action, regret, victory, and loss. And within that maze lived everything he had tried to hold together, the faces, the choices, the lies he had told others, and the ones he had told himself. His body had grown smaller. The prison diet left little room for indulgence. His hair had thinned, and his skin carried the pale tint of isolation. Yet his eyes remained alert, flickering when the guards passed, scanning each movement like a chess player studying the board long after the game had ended, still calculating, even with nothing left to control. He sometimes thought of the labyrinth in a literal sense. the real tunnels he had once commanded, routes beneath cities, under rivers, across borders. He had designed them like riddles, escape hatches laced with oxygen lines, electricity, rails, and silence. Those corridors had given him life, freedom, the illusion of invincibility. Now, in Florence, he was trapped inside a different kind of maze, one without exits, one built from the remnants of his empire and the stillness of an 8 by 10 concrete room. And yet, he walked it daily in his mind. He retraced the rise, the shipments that left Colombia, the pilots he paid, the fishermen who hid bales in hollowed-out boats. He saw the stacks of cash being counted by trembling hands, the bribes made in restaurants, the long journeys by foot through the Sierra when the army had closed every road but couldn't close the mountains. He remembered the faces, some smiling, others pleading, some gone too soon, others still out there, surviving on what was left. He never cried. He didn't believe in tears, but there were moments when his chest felt too heavy to breathe, when the thought of his youngest daughter crossed his mind. She had seen him only through glass now. Her laughter didn't reach through the speaker. Her hands couldn't reach past the barrier. Those visits were rare, and each time he said less. He didn't want her to remember a man growing old and silent. He wanted her to remember the father who built castles from nothing, who flew in on helicopters, who made the world bend around him. But even legends grow old, and even the strongest labyrinths collapse when the world outside forgets their shape. He had outlived many, outmaneuvered most, but not time. Time was the one jailer he could never tunnel past, and so he wandered the only place left to him, the corridors of his own mind, and they too were closing in. As seasons passed silently over Florence, the world outside shifted in small, subtle ways. Presidents changed, cartels rebranded, new names entered the headlines. But in the recesses of the prison's deepest wing, none of it mattered. There, time pooled like still water, unmoved by history. El Chapo rarely spoke now. His words had grown fewer, more deliberate, often reserved for simple requests. The guards treated him with cautious respect, aware of his legend but unmoved by it. He was not the man who once slipped past federal forces. He was the man who now waited each morning for the slot in his door to open, his meal delivered on a plastic tray. But in his solitude, the shadows began to stir. Not nightmares exactly, more like fragments. Old conversations returning without warning, scenes from Sinaloa washed in sepia tones, sometimes the smell of diesel and jungle, other times the weight of silence before a decision. He thought often of Nacho Coronel, of Arturo Beltran Leyva, of Amado Carrillo Fuentes, the ones who had come before, the ones who had walked alongside him through fire and fortune and then disappeared. Some had died in battle, others in betrayal. A few, like him, vanished behind walls, only their stories left to wander freely. They came to him at night, in dreams that didn't follow order, not memories, not quite hallucinations, just visits, quiet ones. One evening, as the light faded into the steel-gridded window, he imagined walking again through the hills of Badiraguato, the pine trees above him, the scent of wet earth below. He was young in the dream, strong again. Before the millions, before the manhunts, just a boy with a bag of oranges and a plan too large for the village that raised him. His mother appeared in the distance, standing by the riverbank, her voice calm, warning him not to run too far. Then it would vanish, as quickly as it came. Me. He never reached them in the dreams, never touched them, but they felt close enough to believe. The past didn't haunt him. It followed him like a quiet echo, too far to answer, too near to ignore. What weighed heavier now were the things left undone, not escapes, not deals, but smaller things, letters never written, friends he had left in the dark, people who had vanished when his empire collapsed, not from death, but from distance. In his world, disappearing wasn't always violence. Sometimes it was silence. And then there were the ones he had outlived, his brother Arturo, his cousin, the loyal drivers and cooks who had never made it to safety. Their names never made the papers, their stories never reached the courtroom, but he remembered them all. Their laughter, their last words, their loyalty. He wondered if they would forgive him, if they understood the choices that had to be made. He had always carried the weight of others' survival on his back, but now there was only himself, a single soul among concrete. No one to protect, no one left to disappoint, just the shadows. And the soft voice of the past walking behind him step for step. The prison air never changed. It smelled faintly of bleach and metal, stale and lifeless. Yet in that sterile stillness, El Chapo began to find a strange rhythm. The world outside had moved beyond his reach, and inside these walls there was nothing left to chase. No routes to plot, no shipments to arrange, no lies to tell or secrets to guard. In this place of pure stillness, Joaquín Guzmán Loera was no longer a kingpin. He was just a man who had walked every corridor of crime, poverty to power, loyalty to betrayal, escape to capture, and now paced the narrow halls of memory. There were no visitors today, no letters, no news, just the sound of footsteps in the hallway and the occasional rustle of paper when a guard turned a page at the desk. Even these sounds, rare as they were, had become familiar comforts. He spent more time sitting now, not always thinking, sometimes simply breathing, watching dust move in the light from the narrow window, listening to the hum of the fluorescent bulb overhead. The human mind adapts to silence the way eyes adjust to darkness. At first, it feels suffocating, but slowly it becomes a space to observe things once ignored. He remembered the feel of dirt roads under his boots, the hot wind through the valleys of Durango, the way laughter echoed through compound walls when business was good, when everyone was fed, when the streets knew his name and whispered it with reverence or fear. Those moments now existed like postcards, still images, no motion. Even when he tried to walk back through them in his mind, the details blurred, faces melted into one another. Dates slipped through the cracks. Only the feeling remained, that deep pulse of command, of being needed, of being feared. Now no one needed him, and fear had no place here. He sometimes thought of writing a letter, a final one, to his children, to his wife, to the few who had stayed near even from afar. But every time he considered it, he found no words. What could he say from a box of cement and steel? That he had built something vast and lost it all? That the empire was real but fleeting? That loyalty, once his weapon, was now his ghost? There was a time for messages, for strategy. That time had passed. Now he simply observed the quiet, not in resistance, not in despair, but in acceptance. He had known the heights of legend and now the depths of disappearance, and in between the two he had lived 1,000 lifetimes, made enemies, created fortunes, ended stories, began others, and now, with the world no longer watching, he was simply still. A stillness deeper than hiding, a stillness earned. In the quiet between the walls, far beyond the steel doors of ADX Florence, the world still said his name. In documentaries, in courtrooms, in hushed conversations between border agents and traffickers, between elders and sons, between journalists and fixers, trying to draw a clearer picture of a man who had blurred every line. Joaquín Guzmán Loera, El Chapo, remained a figure larger than his cage, and yet smaller than the myths he left behind. He had no control over it now. The legacy was no longer his to shape, and so it evolved without him. For every story that called him a genius, another called him a monster. For every folk ballad that painted him as a Robin Hood, a dozen headlines reduced him to numbers. Tons trafficked, lives lost, years sentenced. And somewhere in between, the man himself sat quietly on a thin mattress, listening to the air hum, wondering which version would outlive the others. He thought about legacy often, not as a craving for remembrance, but as a question. What remained after power faded? Was it money? Most of his was seized or scattered. Was it loyalty? Much of that dissolved under pressure, flipped in courtrooms, or buried in shallow graves. Was it family? They carried his name, yes, but at a cost they never asked for. Perhaps legacy was something else, a shape left in the lives of those who followed, a caution, a blueprint, a broken mirror. He had shaped an industry. That was undeniable. His logistics were studied, his methods copied, improved, distorted. Young traffickers still cited his codes, his name still gave weight in the right circles, but that kind of legacy came with a shadow. For every escape that inspired awe, there were children who never saw their fathers again. For every dollar moved, a community poisoned. He had always justified the trade in practical terms. Demand breeds supply. Governments fail, people hunger. The business fills the vacuum. But now, though with no more lies to tell, he saw things more clearly. He had fed an empire, but he had also fed a cycle. And cycles by nature don't end, they evolve. He wasn't the last kingpin, just one of many who came, ruled, and eventually fell. The corridors he once walked now echoed with newer names, men he had never met, men who knew his legend but not his face. Outside, his story became material, books, podcasts, trial exhibits, a thing to be examined, debated, picked apart. Inside, his story simply was, lived, remembered, and slowly dissolving into quiet. He did not ask for redemption. He had made his peace with judgment. What remained now was not regret, but reflection, a final season of stillness, a window through which the world passed without pause. He had once tried to control everything. Now he controlled nothing. And yet in that emptiness there was strange clarity. This, he thought, was the truth of legacy, not what you build, but what remains when no one is watching. In the still hours before dawn, when even the guards moved slower and the silence thickened, Joaquín often stared at the blank sheet of paper on his small desk. The prison issued him supplies every few weeks, lined paper, a dull pencil, envelopes that would be opened and inspected before they ever reached their destination. But he rarely used them. Still, the paper remained, untouched but present, a kind of silent invitation. There were things he had considered writing, words he had rehearsed in his mind over and over, but never committed to ink, not because he lacked the courage, but because he no longer knew what would help or heal or even matter. He had thought of writing to his daughter first, the youngest, the one who had visited him with eyes too soft for the world he came from. What could he tell her, though? That he missed her? That he still imagined her voice in the quiet? That he hoped the stories told about him wouldn't shape her future too much? But how do you write a letter to someone who lives in freedom when you do not? How do you speak to a child from a place where the light doesn't change and the air never moves? He also thought of writing to his mother. She had grown old in Sinaloa while he grew infamous. She had never judged him, never turned away, not even when the news came in waves. When his name became synonymous with violence, with corruption, with war, she still called him mi hijo, but she too was distant now, and age has its own silence. The letter to her stayed unwritten. He considered his old lieutenants, some still out there, some dead, some in cages like his own. He could reach out, say something final, forgive or be forgiven. But the words failed him. What bond was left to nurture? What truth remained that they didn't already know? He even imagined writing to the world itself, a confession, a memoir, a final telling of everything, without embellishment, without caution. He would start with the hills of Badiraguato, the poverty, the ambition, the decisions, all of it. He would write it plainly, not for fame or sympathy, but simply to leave the truth somewhere before it vanished with him. But even that felt futile now. The world had already made up its mind, and so the paper remained blank. It sat on the desk like a mirror, reflecting everything he had not said, everything he had not been able to undo. And strangely, he grew fond of its silence. It didn't demand anything from him, it didn't judge, it simply waited. One morning, he picked up the pencil, not to write, but just to feel it between his fingers. The weight was light, but in his hand it felt heavier than any weapon he had ever held. Words had power, and in some ways they were the last power he had left. Still, he did not write. Not yet. Maybe tomorrow, maybe never. But the blank page stayed near, quiet, patient, and open. Time, once a weapon in his hand, now moved in ways El Chapo couldn't measure. There were no watches in this place, no ticking clocks, no sunrise visible through the narrow sliver of window. Only the rhythmic gestures of the guards, the timed arrival of meals, the low mechanical buzz of security systems echoing at routine intervals. It was through these subtle markers that he learned to track the days, not by numbers, but by patterns. Time had once been his ally. In the fields, it had meant crop cycles. In business, shipment schedules. In warfare, timing was everything. When to move, when to disappear, when to strike, when to retreat. It was a rhythm he had mastered, bending seconds and hours to his will. Now, time was his cellmate. It sat beside him as he lay awake through the night. It walked with him as he paced 5 steps one way, 5 steps back. It lingered at his side like a quiet observer, noting the slowness of his breath, the stillness in his body, the dull ache in his joints that had come with age. There were no calendars here, but he remembered dates. The day of his first arrest in Guatemala, the day he escaped from Puente Grande in a laundry cart, the day he rose to full command of the Sinaloa Federation, the day he sat down with Colombian suppliers, laughing over strategies that would carry billions across borders, and the day the tunnel was dug beneath the Altiplano prison floor, the perfect escape that stunned the world and proved his myth once more. But those days had passed, and time, unbound by memory, continued without pause. He had often wondered what kind of man he would have become had he not entered the drug trade. Would he have stayed in the mountains, married young, raised cattle? Would he have worked the fields like his father, breaking his back beneath the sun for a handful of pesos each week? Or would he still have found some way to rise? See, even if the path were honest. Time didn't answer such questions, it merely held them. Some prisoners marked the walls with scratches. He never did. He didn't need reminders of how long he'd been here. What mattered now wasn't how much time had passed, but what remained, and with each passing week it seemed that less remained than before. His body, once agile, was slowing, his hearing softened. His hands, once steady under pressure, now trembled faintly when he rose from the metal cot. He did not fear dying here. That was expected, but he did wonder, when would it come? A heart failing in the night, an illness left untreated, or something quieter, like a final sleep from which no morning returned. The clock in Florence did not tick, but he could hear it all the same, not on the walls, inside him, a soft rhythm marking the last chapters, not loud, but always there. Though the air in his cell was dry and scentless, Joaquín often imagined the breeze of the Sierra Madre, cool, pine-scented, carrying the earthy breath of the mountains that had once raised him. In those quiet hours of solitude, he would close his eyes and let his mind drift back to Sinaloa, not the blood-soaked routes or the guarded compounds, but the hills of his youth, the raw land, the dirt paths, the tiny streams that cut through the slopes. That was where it had all begun. He could still remember the early mornings, waking before the sun, his small hands helping his father haul wood, the sounds of insects and distant dogs, the way hunger clung to the bones, and how silence then was not peace, but absence of opportunity, of options, of a future. In those early years, it had not been about ambition, it had been about survival. The poppy fields changed that. The older boys spoke of buyers, of pesos, of paths leading away from the hills. And Guzmán listened, not with wonder, but with calculation. Even as a child, he knew instinctively that the world beyond his valley had rules he would need to learn, and learn quickly, if he ever wanted more than dust and silence. He never forgot where he came from, not when he was building tunnels, not when he was sending jets full of powder north, not when he was on the run, hidden in the canyons, listening to the pulse of helicopters in the distance. Sinaloa had shaped his bones, taught him the art of resilience. The rules of the land were simple. Strength earned respect, and weakness invited death. Even as he grew richer, more powerful, more infamous, part of him remained tethered to that mountain boy. The one who watched from the brush, the one who didn't speak unless there was something worth saying, the one who learned patience long before he learned violence. Now, in this concrete box, it was the mountains he missed. Most. Not the men, not the money, not the empire, but the sound of wind between trees, the smell of damp earth, the sight of clouds rolling over high ridges, as if the land itself were breathing. In his cell, there was no sky, but in his memory, it stretched endlessly. He sometimes wondered if the mountains remembered him, if the land mourned the man he became, or if it accepted him fully, as just another product of hard soil and harsher choices. Maybe the hills bore no judgment. Maybe they simply endured the way he once had. Some nights he dreamt of walking those slopes again. No guards, no guns, just him, older, quieter, placing one foot after another on familiar trails. No destination, no escape plan, just movement, just peace. He knew he would never return. But the mountains remained inside him, silent, steady, unchanged. From the quiet of his isolation cell, El Chapo could still feel the reach of what he once built. Though the corridors were silent and his communication severed, he knew the Sinaloa Federation had not collapsed with his capture. It had shifted, it had hardened, it had adapted. He had always designed it that way. Long before the headlines, the Sinaloa cartel had been less an organization and more a network, a lattice of lieutenants, brokers, smugglers, and killers strung across continents. It did not rely on one man. It thrived on its ability to disappear, to shift identities, to turn from predator to phantom with a single phone call. That was his legacy, not the product or the profits, but the design. He thought often of those who had stood with him. Ismael El Mayo Zambada, the quiet strategist who had never seen a cell, who walked carefully and spoke rarely. Mayo was not a ghost, but he moved like one, always just beyond reach, always careful enough to avoid the spotlight. The contrast had always been clear. El Chapo was the symbol, Mayo was the structure. Then there were the younger ones. Damaso Lopez, once trusted, once close, until ambition overtook loyalty, until words spoken in interrogation rooms weighed more than blood. Betrayal was common in their world, but it still cut deep even if you saw it coming. And the sons, his own, raised inside the empire, expected to follow paths carved by shadows. Some had adapted, others had stumbled. All of them carried his name like a loaded weapon. The Federation had changed. It no longer needed a figurehead. It no longer thrived on his charisma or reputation. Its roots had grown too deep, its branches too tangled. Even here, buried behind steel and concrete, he could sense it moving, adjusting routes, forming new alliances, navigating the endless cat-and-mouse game with governments and rivals. But it wasn't just Sinaloa anymore. There were others, younger factions, ruthless, undisciplined, cartels without memory, built on blood alone. They lacked the codes that once governed even the darkest corners of the trade. To El Chapo, these new players felt like fire, uncontrolled, indiscriminate. His federation had operated like a business, violent, yes, but strategic. These new syndicates operated like warlords, obsessed with spectacle. Where he had avoided chaos, they embraced it. Where he had aimed to remain unseen, they demanded attention. He wondered what would become of it all. Would the Federation outlast him by decades? Or would it fracture, eaten from within by greed and mistrust? Would his sons rise to preserve it, or be devoured by it? He had once imagined being remembered as a master architect. Now he feared the foundation might be made of sand. Still, part of him felt pride. Pride in what he built, pride in the precision. And yet, a quieter voice reminded him, a legacy that breeds more violence is not legacy, it is a curse passed down. And so he sat alone, listening to the silence. And in that silence, the shadows of the Federation moved on. The prison had eyes that never blinked. From the moment Joaquín Guzmán was lowered into the Supermax system, he ceased being a man and became a high-value containment. Cameras hung in every corner of his cell, lenses angled precisely. Microphones captured the rustle of his movement, the scratch of pencil on paper, the soft sighs that sometimes slipped into the air unnoticed. Even in sleep, he was watched. He had once been the watcher. From fortified compounds, he had studied the screens, live feeds of border crossings, cartel safe houses, airstrips in the jungle. He had watched lieutenants make deals, watched smugglers load trucks, watched enemies arrive and disappear. He had built his empire with eyes open wide. Now the roles had reversed. The watchers here were faceless. Shifts rotated quietly. Guards behind glass, analysts in distant rooms. Their job was not to understand him, but to contain him. There would be no chance for escape, no lapses in procedure. The past had ensured that. They called ADX Florence the Alcatraz of the Rockies, but Guzmán knew it was far colder than Alcatraz ever was. This was a fortress built for silence, where men vanished not by violence, but by obscurity. Even his letters were read before they left the room, his meals measured and recorded, his movements logged. He sometimes wondered what they saw when they looked at him. Did they see a king in exile, a relic of an older world, or just another number behind a reinforced door? He thought about how much the world had changed. Surveillance had once meant men with binoculars, crackling radios, informants in the field. Now, satellites hovered quietly in the sky. Drones circled jungles. Data mapped out patterns of life, calls, texts, footsteps, faces. He had evaded it all for years, until he couldn't. The watchers had always been there, in courtrooms, in foreign offices, in junts, operations, always closing in, and even when he slipped through their grasp, they never stopped recording. Files thicker than books, pages filled with names, dates, coordinates. Now, the watchers had won. And still, they watched. But they would see no more secrets, no more codes, no more maps. What remained of him was inside now, quiet, unrevealed. He had learned to stop looking back at the cameras. He no longer challenged them with his stare. That had been a younger man's gesture. Now he simply existed within the lens. Silent, measured, unchanged by the gaze. And in that stillness, something strange took shape. Not defeat, but acceptance. He would not escape their view, but he would not be broken by it either. Let them watch. The world had been watching for years, but they would never truly see the man behind the name. In the quiet hours between light checks and meal deliveries, Joaquín often turned over names in his mind, names of those he had trusted, those he had feared, those he had buried, and those who had buried him. Each name was like a stone dropped into still water, sending out slow, rippling memories. His own name, Joaquín Archivaldo Guzmán Loera, had once meant nothing outside his dusty village. Just another mouth to feed, another boy too poor to stay in school. But in time the world would come to know it, then shorten it, then brand it. El Chapo, two words that came to mean power, blood, wealth, escape. His size had once made him a target of ridicule. Later, it became a title that cloaked something much larger. To the world, El Chapo was no longer a man, but a myth stitched together by headlines, DEA briefings, whispered narco corridos, and court testimonies. But he remembered when it had simply been a childhood nickname spoken under a straw roof. Other names followed him: El Mayo, El Azul, Arturo Beltran, Amado, Carrillo, La Barbie, El Mencho, names that had once stood beside his. Some allies, some ghosts, some enemies now long buried under concrete or jungle soil. In this business, names were currency. The more feared the name, the more doors it opened and the more crosshairs it attracted. He thought of the politicians too, the ones who had shaken his hand behind closed doors, the officials who once accepted envelopes thick with folded bills, the commanders who looked away. Many of those names never made the news, but he remembered them. And then there were the names that carried no threat, the ones that struck deepest: his mother, his children, his wives. He remembered the sound of his mother's voice, the way she prayed softly even as the world around them crumbled. He remembered how his children looked at him when they were young, before they understood who he was beyond the fences, before the myths, before the headlines. He wondered what they thought of him now, not as El Chapo, as a father, as a man. There was one name that never came easily: Joaquín. In this place it was rarely spoken. In Florence, he was referred to by number, identity stripped down to routine and regulation. But inside himself he tried to hold on to it. Not the empire, not the title, but the boy behind the name. The one from La Tuna, the one who sold oranges on the roadside, the one who stared up at mountains and imagined more. He knew his name would live on long after him, not in marble or museums, but in ballads and books, in law enforcement databases, in the scars of communities that had endured the weight of his trade. But the truth of a name was always smaller than its shadow, and in the end he was just a man with memories, sitting in a cell, turning them over like stones. One by one, the nights at Florence were long, the kind that stretched beyond time, beyond space, where even thought felt still. Here, in this box of stone and steel, Joaquín Guzmán no longer lived as a fugitive, nor as a king. He simply existed, measured in meals, steps, and air exchanged through vents. The world had moved on. News no longer spoke his name with urgency. Rivals had risen, alliances had shifted, new corridors of trade had opened, carved by younger, hungrier men, with less to lose and more to prove. The cartels he once guided like ships through fog had become different beasts. He no longer steered them. He no longer knew their faces. He didn't need to. Time had made that irrelevant. He spent much of his day in silence, reading less, writing rarely. There were no grand reflections, no schemes, no memoirs, only moments, small ones, a detail in a dream, a line from a song echoing faintly from a memory, the shadow of a guard passing by the door. Once, the sound of footsteps meant decisions, life or death, orders given or received. Now, they simply marked another lap of the clock. His body had grown slower, his eyes more tired. The fire that once burned so fiercely in him, driving tunnels, escapes, betrayals, wars, had cooled into embers. He didn't rage against the walls. He didn't plot one final move. He sat with it, all of it, the cost, the glory, the damage, the quiet. Sometimes he imagined La Tuna again, the way dawn crept over the hills, the distant barking of dogs, the smell of wet dirt and boiling beans. Those memories were his alone, untouched by court documents, press stories, or testimony. They were soft, like fog, and in them he was no kingpin, no myth, no El Chapo, just a boy beneath wide skies, looking toward the horizon, not yet knowing what the world would demand of him. The rise had been dizzying, the fall absolute. But in this ending, the was no judgment in the walls, no voice declaring right or wrong, just dust and silence. That was how it would end, not with fire, not with fury, but with quiet steps vanishing into the long corridor of memory. And far beyond, the Sierra Madre stood unchanged, whispering wind through pine, still there, still waiting, but never to be returned to, only remembered.